We covered Viv Vision yesterday, but now we have so much else to cover because so many other cards also came out. Let's take a look at Moira X, Omega Sentinel, Awesome Andy, and Sparky, which range from incredibly impactful to minimally impactful. Sparky on the Season Pass premium track has a very powerful ability if you are able to make it work. A 2/1 with an activate ability that moves your most recently moved card back to where it was and gives it +3 power. This card very clearly synergizes with Human Torch. And yes, it synergizes with a lot of the move payoffs, but it synergizes with Human Torch to such an incredible degree that it creates a bit of a dichotomy in terms of how games play out when you have Human Torch with Sparky and how they play out when you don't. Because without Human Torch, this is just a good move multiplier, but I don't think you necessarily would see it in the same light. With Human Torch, this is a recipe for 30 or 40 or 50 power in a lane. At a certain point, it stops mattering what the number is. The number is the Human Torch wins this lane, or it gets blown up by a Shang-Chi or a Shadow King. That is the largest contribution Sparky is making, but it leaves a lot of his decks with open questions, like, what happens when we don't draw Human Torch? Because making the call to actually invest your Sparky into another card, it might be the right call, but it's hard to do. Because you can draw Human Torch very late and still have access to a good Sparky play with it. Just doing something like Sparky with an Iron Fist and a Ghost Spider on the final turn of the game can create an incredibly large Human Torch, and that might be something you want to actually save Sparky for. This tension of being so much better with Human Torch than with the other move payoffs is, in my opinion, the fundamental thing to understand about what Sparky is doing in the current iteration of Marvel Snap. It is in every single one of his decks. Question number one is, when we do get Sparky Human Torch, how do we win the other lane? Because Human Torch has one on lock. Question number two is, when we don't get Sparky Human Torch, are the other move carries enough to carry you to a higher level? It felt like when playing this list and playing against these lists, it was very much about, I'm going to win the lanes the Human Torch isn't in because they're just not going to have enough power to win those other lanes. And until that gets alleviated, and yes, there are cards like Sage, cards like Dagger, like they're not bad cards, but the degree by which Human Torch is winning his lanes is almost unapproachable. Your opponents are often not going to win a lane where a good Human Torch Sparky is, but they can win a lane where basically everything else you do is. In terms of deck building, this is the base move bounce list with Sparky in it. The real debate is whether or not you are playing Frigga or Doctor Strange. I personally found Frigga more useful because of that issue with force multiplication that this deck can have if you are not popping off. If you don't have that Human Torch, you need to have something, and you need to have another copy of it a lot of the time. I buy that for a high-level player, you could rather play Doctor Strange. Me personally, I think that Frigga is a better inclusion in this list. This is a very typical move bounce list, but I do think the inclusion of Sparky opens up some different kinds of play patterns, as well as the fact that there are people playing Cosmic Ghost Rider out there, which means that while you may be incentivized to save the Sparky, some of the time you're going to want to fire it off as early as you can in order to make sure that you get the output you want. On the whole, though, this list has not changed dramatically. It is still doing the same things. It would like to throw priority. It would then like to spend the final turn playing an appreciably impossible to beat large number of power. That is what this deck is about. Big Move is taking an approach that I generally kind of like and saying, look, we're going to win the lanes that aren't Human Torch by just having some actual big bodies in the deck. And it's something that generally Move Bounce lacks. It does not have very large men a lot of the time, whereas a deck like this can do things like, oh, I'm going to play a guy, I'm going to blink that guy blink is going to though get like a Heimdall or an Alioth, and I'm going to have enough numbers that I can reasonably approach another lane and try to actually beat it. The various things that this deck gets that are extremely powerful, I mean, when you talk about really powerful stuff, Hellion into Heimdall is an unbelievably powerful play, and the fact that you have such control over where your cards are going to be on the final turn of the game, the fact that you have a sort of backup carry and Craven and things of that nature, you just end up feeling like this is a more well-rounded deck, but it does lack some of the pure explosiveness of like, here's my 36 power Human Torch, and then I copied it, and here's my other 36 power Human Torch. You don't get those, but I have found that they don't line up that much in the decks that are capable of it. So I think that this is, generally speaking, an idea that I appreciate, and it at least attempts to address some of the issues that Move Bounce has in terms of what happens when you're not Human Torching. Is this deck at a generally meta output level of points when you're not Human Torching? And if you are not doing that, do you at least have a scam built in that can allow you to get to that level? And Heimdall sort of answers a lot of those questions in the affirmative. And so I think this is a very solid place to start. Moving on to Moira X, who is currently bugged. If your opponent clicks her, they will be able to see the cards you're getting. It makes her a lot worse, but the good news is she's not that amazing to begin with, although I have found some reasonable upside for trying to play her. A lot of what she's doing is perhaps superfluous, but there are some real high roll upsides that you can play when you play with Moira X, and I think it's worth talking about those. Largely, Moira X seems to have two homes right now. They are Deadpool decks, and they are decks that are going to be playing things like Victoria Hand. In the Victoria Hand decks, you have to run a balance. I don't want to have too many cards in my hand and then have this brick my draw if there's actually cards in my deck that I want to draw, but I also want to have a lot of cards that give me cards for Victoria Hand. It's a bit of a hard line to walk. In the Deadpool decks, she's very much just, you play this, you blow her up, you get some stuff that's probably useful to you. Deadpool decks run on sort of repetition. So if you have a hand that, say, doesn't have a guy that blows something up in it, and you draw, or doesn't have an extra guy that blows something up in it, you can get that second Venom or second Deathlock or whatever out of a Moira X, and that can allow you to have some minorly better plays, like maybe playing a Venom instead of a Deathlock down the line. You can also do things like when you get a death, make sure that you focus on making the death very cheap, and that will allow you to have a second death. That is a powerful play out of Moira X available in the Deadpool deck. But largely, I do think there she's just adding some oomph and confusion. But there is something to be said for that, because one of the biggest weaknesses the Deadpool deck has is incredible predictability, and if she is able to make your turns unpredictable, I think most people will still be playing against the Deadpool deck in a very similar way. Here's what it looks like, by the way, and the low curve here is meant to give you as much possible value off of Moira as you can get. With a curve this low, the idea is that your Moira is very often going to give you stuff that you are actually going to play. So you're very, 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 very often going to get the cards off of the Moira and still actually be able to play them. That's one of the big things that Moira runs into. You will see some versions of Moira decks using things like Quinjet, right? That's another attempt at alleviating this. One of the baseline things to understand about this card is you're not going to actually get any advantage out of having her unless you are able to actually play the cards that she makes. This is not a game like Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone, where just having cards in your hand that you can trade with your opponents for resources is a meaningful thing. This game ends on turn 6, whether you like it or not, unless you are Magic. So that means that you need realizable cards in your Moira X deck, and that is largely what this build is aimed at getting to. Similarly, there are some really powerful things that you can do in a Victoria Hand Destroy Shell. It's just I don't know that Moira X actually wants to be part of it. The things that Victoria Hand Destroy can do are usually involving doubling up with Fire Hair, and usually that's good because it gives you a lot of really strong guys in your hand, which often means that your hand is too full for Moira X when you play this deck. And there are different ways at trying to approach this, but largely in this shell, what I mostly feel is she's pretty good if you can make her happen, but probably ends up on balance just worse than trying to play a Moon Girl, because you have so much more control over what you hit with the Moon Girl. And even though it is like the one advantage you get out of being a Moira deck here is that you get to be a Killmonger deck, and being a Killmonger deck in the V-Hand Mirror is awesome because they don't really expect you to be a Killmonger deck, and having Killmonger in your deck is just such a really powerful way to do really impactful board-wide plays against other people playing demon-based decks. But generally, I would say that she ends up a little bit below par here because the cards she's giving you are just probably not as good as like, oh, I miseried my hand and then I had a fire hair on board and like all of that. Like, I'd rather have a bunch of demons than what Moira is giving me. Next up, Omega Sentinel, a card that on rate is definitely pretty okay. For 3, activate, give -7 power to the highest power thing on your opponent's side of the board. That is a baseline 4/10, but you do need to play it before the final turn of the game in order for it to actually be functional. There are things that do synergize with a card like this where much of the power is in the ability. Think of it like a claw that can be meaningfully upgraded by cards like Merlin's Evolution or Cersei, and I think you'll sort of start to get what this card is actually doing. It's also seen some interesting play in Cerebro Fusions, where you have a version of the Cerebro deck that is built more around Affliction. This card afflicts. You have the ability to play things like Scorpion. You can even play Hazmat if you're risky. I don't recommend it, but you can. And you can play your own Luke Cage as well. So you have multiple Afflictors at the 3 spot. You also get Diamondback, which gives you a more proactive line on trying to be able to, A, beat some really high point output decks. You can beat Hela with a Diamondback and a US Agent, for example, or B, try to have a coherent game plan when your Cerebro game plan just isn't coming together. It sort of looks like this, and I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being a very viable variant of Cerebro, say that 3 times fast. I think that this is a legitimately decent build. It's just a question of what you're giving up versus what you're losing, what matters in the metagame at the moment. What this build does to me is be a pretty decent amount better against other combo style decks that are just focusing on total point output, like Hela, for example. This deck is going to be much better against that. But losing out on something like Killmonger will necessarily make you worse in the matchups where Killmonger is good. And that is something that is absolutely worth worrying about. Generally, though, I would not be surprised to see this become, if not a dominant mode of C3, at least a fairly popular one, and at least a deck that people recognize as, oh yeah, it's the Affliction version of C3, because I think this is basically pretty real to me. This strikes me as like a very real thing to do. If I'm not mistaken, I got this list from WOAH. He was very, very high on the idea of Diamondback US Agent generally into Hela. I think a lot of that is just because there are a couple of notorious Hela mains near the top of North American ladder, so you kind of have to account for them some of the time. But it does legitimately give you like, oh, I'm doing more of this powerful stuff. I have more inbuilt synergies. Sometimes you can draw the wrong half of the deck, but hopefully in those games, you just win those by virtue of being a Cerebro deck anyway, and it doesn't actually end up mattering that you have your Diamondback with no real ways to afflict or whatever. And it's like, okay, yeah, I might get Luke Caged, but nobody plays a Luke Cage realistically right now except other Cerebro decks. And for the record, you probably are giving up some percentage against other Cerebro decks here. Ozymandias is pretty bad. There's not really a way around that. I mean, there's the same sort of pitch that you could make for him as the card whose power is wrapped up in his abilities. He's like a pretty okay card if you want to evolve him later. 2 to 3 is not bad. Getting 4 points of power out of this guy and then turning him into a more reasonable body, like, I can see how that kind of stuff would make sense to people. It's not the worst idea anyone's ever had. I think it's a pretty cool thing to try to do, but fundamentally, this is sort of activate Toxidoxy. It's fine, but I don't really understand why it exists. Someone pointed out to me, I've been talking about how they've made 3 bad Herbies, or 3 cards that are Herbie modes. This card is a mode of Herbie. We have Jennifer Kale that is a mode of Herbie. And of course, we have Frankie Ray, who is a mode of Herbie, but we don't have that 4th mode of Herbie. It has been pointed out to me that Rhino is that 4th mode of Herbie. Herbie, of course, 7 power over 2 bodies, one of which is a rock. Rhino, 5 power over 2 bodies, one of which is a rock. So we have collected the Herbie Infinity Stones with the release of Awesome Andy. There's just a lot of those. It's all right. I guess. I think that Rhino one is more of a stretch because there are meaningful differences between Activate and On Reveal. Rhino being a 2/5 on the final turn of the game is better than a Herbie in a lot of cases. So I don't really, it's a stretch, but I'm willing to count it, is what I'm going to say. Long story short, Awesome Andy is mid. And yeah, you can play him in the buff deck. Yes, you can just slap him in the deck that runs all the cards that buff stuff, but he's probably worse than Okoye if you're going to do that, and he's definitely worse than Surge if you're going to do that. So why bother? Why not at least try to build around his upside, which is what this list is trying to do? taking the Merlin Cersei synergy on both Omega Sentinel and Awesome Andy, saying what I'm going to do is I'm going to activate these, get the majority of their power. Since the majority of their power is in activates, I can then use the useless bodies they leave behind, their discarded robot husks, in order to create extra value by evolving them with Merlin or shuffling them away if I feel the need to get that extra energy, or evolving them with Cersei. There's some cool stuff going on here. It feels a little bit sub-meta power level, but not by as much as you might think. There are some actually powerful plays in this deck, and it is kind of useful to have, oh, look at all these points, oh, look at all this power. These guys are like if you had a bunch of Iron Hearts that weren't so all in on that, like you could target them a little bit more, I think. And that's sort of how I look at these two cards. They're not amazing, but if you want to build to optimize them, I think you probably can. I think Omega Sentinel has a far greater room for growth than Awesome Andy does, much closer to a reasonable rate on her. Much more interesting card, Awesome Andy. Activate Toxidoxy might be a stretch. Maybe I'll get clown for this. It'll be clipped and I'll slow it down and put it in black and white in the front of a future video, but I don't think that's going to happen. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I asked for feedback on how to structure this video in the comments to my last video, and I hope that this was something that you guys enjoyed as a structure. They're going to keep releasing a lot of cards, and figuring out how to cover them properly is something I'm going to want to try to do. So thank you so much for watching. If you have any further feedback on the structure of this video and the last video, because one was on just Viv Vision, then these other 4 here, how would you like to see them structured in the first? In this case, would you like to see a focus on power, a focus on the season pass card? Just generally let me know. I'm trying to figure out how to structure my content going forward in a way that will allow you guys to enjoy it, but not overwhelm you. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and nothing can change that. I will see you in the next one.